Summer 1943. The jungle breathed like a living furnace, its air heavy with damp rot and the hum of insects that refused to rest. Heat pressed on the shoulders of soldiers who crouched beneath tangled branches, and every exhale seemed swallowed by the leaves. In that green labyrinth, silence was both shield and trap. A bird would call, a twig would snap, and men trained to survive would tense, as if the earth itself were about to explode. Amidst this waiting, a single strip of polished brass glimmered faintly in the hand of an American Marine. 8 cartridges aligned in their steel cradle, an ordinary object that, soon, would thunder like a choir of church bells tolling for those who underestimated its voice. Captain Daniel Miller studied the jungle path ahead, his face calm, carved more by discipline than by age. At 32, he looked older, the corners of his mouth pulled down in lines of command. He carried the M1 Garand the way a farmer carries a trusted plow, as if the tool were an extension of muscle and purpose. He knew its cadence by heart, the rhythm of trigger and recoil, the metallic punctuation of an empty clip. Beside him, Lieutenant Robert Hayes shifted on one knee, the butt of his rifle pressed into his shoulder. He was younger, restless, with an expression that mixed confidence with a soldier's superstition. For him, the Garand was not merely a weapon, but a steel heartbeat, one that promised to answer chaos with order. Across the jungle, hidden in a ridge of damp earth, Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka signaled to his men with 2 fingers. The Japanese NCO had survived more campaigns than he could count, and his stern eyes carried the gravity of one who had witnessed steel consume flesh too many times. His rifle, the Arisaka Type 99, rested against his palm. Reliable, yes, but slow, each shot a ritual of bolt and breath. He believed in endurance, in discipline, in the spirit of Yamato Damashii, the soul of Japan. Yet even in his marrow he felt a whisper of doubt, for rumors had spread through their ranks of an American rifle that never seemed to rest. Private Kenji Mori crouched behind him, barely 20, sweat streaking his brow. He clutched his bayonet as though it were a talisman. He had been raised on stories of bravery, told that spirit would overcome machinery, that a man's shout of banzai could shake the enemy's will. But he had not yet seen a Garand speak. His heart pounded not only with fear, but with the stubborn innocence of someone still convinced that war might unfold like the tales sung by elders. One clean charge, one noble clash. The silence stretched. On the American side, Miller lifted his hand. Hayes steadied his breathing. Somewhere beyond the thickets, Tanaka whispered a prayer into the earth. Then the world broke. The first shot from Hayes's Garand cracked like a whip across the canopy, scattering birds in panicked flight. The jungle recoiled, and the heartbeat that followed, 7 more flashes erupted from American rifles, each echo snapping against the trunks like lightning chained in rhythm. The Japanese expected the familiar pause, one shot, then the brief stillness of reloading. Instead, the fire rolled on, relentless, as if the Americans had harnessed a storm. Mori froze. He had braced himself to rise, to charge, to close the distance with steel. But the air itself seemed shredded by the continuous thunder. Every time he blinked, another comrade fell, ripped down before even lifting his own rifle. Tanaka barked commands, his voice steady, urging men forward. He fired his own Arisaka, the bolt slamming back, the cartridge ejecting, the ritual ingrained in his bones. Yet each shot felt like a candle sputtering against a hurricane. On the other side, Hayes pressed the trigger again and again, his ears ringing from the recoil, his shoulder bruising beneath the force. He felt both awe and terror at how easily the rifle transformed him into a machine of precision. Each squeeze was a decision. Each decision took a life. Between shots he caught sight of Mori, a boy, barely more than that, crouched under roots, eyes wide, torn between charging and fleeing. Hayes thought, in the fraction of a second, that the war had turned young men into mirrors of each other, separated only by the metal in their hands. The clip in Miller's Garand pinged free, a clear, metallic chime that seemed out of place amid the carnage. For Americans, it was a signal, the promise of another 8 rounds already waiting. For Japanese ears, it was an omen, the sound of endless fire, a reminder that their enemy's weapon did not tire as quickly as human courage. Tanaka heard it. For a moment, his discipline cracked, a flicker of disbelief passing across his stern features. He shouted for Mori to move, to charge, to trust in the bayonet. Mori rose, feet heavy in the mud, and sprinted a few yards before a burst of Garand fire tore the branches beside him. He collapsed back into cover, trembling, his shout lost in the storm. Hayes paused only when his own clip sprang free, the ping sharp and pure. In that silence, he caught his breath, and for the first time felt the weight of what he was doing. The jungle smelled of cordite and sweat, of churned soil and fear. He thought briefly of home, of Kansas wheat fields, and how the sound of a harvest sickle swishing through grain now echoed in this mechanical scythe of steel. Miller reloaded smoothly, his face unreadable. He knew the rhythm must continue, that hesitation would be betrayal. He did not relish it, but he understood it. Fire was survival, and survival demanded relentlessness. Tanaka gathered his remaining men. His voice hardened, his words clipped, yet inside he wondered if the soul of Japan could endure this kind of thunder. He caught Mori's eyes, saw the fear, the confusion, the shattering of illusions. The boy had expected honor, but found himself staring into a wall of ceaseless fire. As the battle subsided, the jungle groaned under the weight of silence once more. Smoke curled upward through shafts of sunlight, broken leaves drifting like ash. The Americans checked their rifles, the routine of war etched into their motions. The Japanese survivors pulled back, hearts pounding, dignity frayed. Mori sank into the earth, clutching his bayonet as if it could still promise salvation. Hay sat back, exhausted, his Garand cooling in his hands. Both men, oceans apart in culture, were bound in that moment by the realization that war had become something neither of their fathers could have imagined. And as the echo of that last metallic ping faded into the canopy, each side felt it. The dawn of a new kind of warfare, one where courage alone could not compete with steel's relentless voice. What came next? None of them could predict, but all understood that the silence before the roar would never be the same again. The jungle at night was never truly silent. Cicadas rasped like saws grinding against bone. Frogs croaked in hollow rhythms, and somewhere unseen, branches snapped under the weight of creatures that wanted nothing to do with war. Yet for the soldiers pressed into the damp soil, every sound folded into the same menacing chorus. Darkness seemed alive, its shadows swelling with possibility. When the first Garand shot tore through the canopy, the noise didn't simply echo. It multiplied, bouncing from tree to tree, until the whole forest became an amplifier for death. Lieutenant Robert Hayes steadied his rifle, sweat rolling into his eyes. His world had shrunk to the geometry of sight and trigger. Each squeeze was answered by a flash that lit the leaves silver, each recoil reminding him that he was still breathing. But what unnerved him most was not the chaos he unleashed. It was the way the jungle itself carried his rifle's voice, magnifying it into something larger than a man. To Hayes, it felt less like he was firing and more like the Garand was speaking through him, its cadence dictating the rhythm of survival. Captain Daniel Miller crouched nearby, his face a mask of grim focus. He had seen firefights before, yet each engagement carried the weight of something new. Tonight, it was the uncanny persistence of the Garand song. The rifle's semi-automatic rhythm left no gaps for the enemy to breathe. Miller knew the Japanese had been trained to expect pauses, the momentary silence of bolt-action reloads. Instead, what came from the Americans was a seamless wave, the mechanical heart of industry pulsing through every trigger pull. He could almost imagine the factories back home, lines of workers feeding steel into machines, their labor echoing here as fire in the dark. On the other side, Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka pressed his back against a tree trunk, jaw clenched. His Arasaka felt suddenly fragile, a relic outpaced by time. He fired when he could, each shot deliberate, his hands steady from years of training. But between his measured cracks came torrents of American thunder, and he could not help but feel that his rifle was whispering against a hurricane. He glanced at Private Kenji Mori, who crouched low, eyes wide with disbelief. The boy's hands shook around his bayonet, the blade catching moonlight like a prayer. Tanaka spoke low, urging patience, urging bravery, yet he knew those words carried less weight after every fresh burst of Garand fire. Corporal Yutaka Sato, positioned a few meters away, tried to count the American shots. 1, 2, 3, 4, yet before he could reach 8, another clip had already replaced the first. He had grown up in a household where silence was revered, where discipline meant conserving words and energy. Now, the American rifles filled every second, leaving no space for silence, no room for thought. He felt as though he were drowning not in bullets, but in noise. The jungle, once their ally, had betrayed them, giving voice to the enemy's machines. Hayes shifted his aim, watching tracers burn brief scars across the dark. He saw Sato's figure rise and vanish in the same instant, cut down before his charge could gather momentum. Hayes felt no triumph, only a grim tightening in his chest. He remembered his father's words, "A man is measured by how he swings his hammer." But tonight, it was not hammers that measured men. It was the volume of their rifles, the speed of their clips, the way industry had learned to replace patience with repetition. He muttered under his breath, half to himself, half to the weapon, "You're hungrier than I am," as he shoved another clip home. Miller caught the remark, a corner of his mouth twitching despite himself. Even in slaughter, humor found its cracks. He knew Hayes's words were not bravado, but a release, a small spark of humanity against the grind. That spark mattered, for without it, the line between soldier and machine would vanish entirely. Tanaka barked an order, his voice rising above the cacophony. His men surged forward, bayonets gleaming, shouting the word they had been taught could split the enemy's soul. Banzai. For a moment, the air seemed to change, charged with the electricity of raw courage. But the Garands answered, swift and unyielding, each exclamation point louder than the last. The Japanese charge faltered, then crumbled, courage drowned beneath the tide. Mori stumbled back, his shout dying in his throat. He looked at Tanaka, whose eyes blazed with a refusal to yield, even as his body staggered from exhaustion. For Mori, the myth unraveled. Spear alone could not close the distance, could not silence the rifles. His belief in inherited glory wavered, leaving only the cold certainty of steel. The Americans advanced cautiously, the barrels of their Garands glowing faintly from overuse. The smell of cordite clung to their uniforms, sharp as burnt rubber. Hayes brushed sweat from his brow, feeling the rifle's weight as both burden and shield. Around him, the jungle looked scarred, trees pocked with bullet holes, ferns shredded into tatters. It was as though the forest itself bore witness, recording the violence in scars of bark and soil. Miller paused, listening. The echoes lingered, repeating fragments of shots as though the jungle were reluctant to let them die. It was in that echo chamber that he recognized the war's new face. This was no duel of men trading blows. It was a dialogue between nations, between factories, between ideologies of spirit and steel. And in that dialogue, the Garand spoke louder than any sermon. Tanaka pulled Mori to his feet, his grip firm despite his own fatigue. "Stand," he commanded, voice hoarse. Mori obeyed, though his knees shook. Tanaka knew his men were unraveling, but he refused to let them see his own doubt. He thought of his ancestors, of battles fought with sword and arrow, of a time when honor decided outcomes. Now honor seemed muted, smothered beneath the ceaseless thunder. He wondered if courage had an expiration date, if perhaps it withered when faced with the endless appetite of a machine. The firefight ebbed, leaving the forest in uneasy quiet. Smoke drifted low, mixing with the mist. For the survivors on both sides, silence no longer offered peace. It carried the weight of what had just thundered through it. Hayes exhaled, staring at the rifle in his hands. He wanted to believe it was only a tool, but in the echoing dark, it felt more like a voice, one that would keep speaking long after he wished it would stop. Maury wiped his face with trembling hands. He thought of home, of fields untouched by war, of a mother who had promised him honor if he served. He had come seeking that promise. Instead, he found himself clutching his rifle not as a weapon, but as a shield against the unrelenting roar. Tanaka studied the horizon, eyes narrowing. The Americans would advance again, of that he was certain. He also knew his men would follow, even if spirit dragged them where strength could not. Yet in his chest, a question formed, one he dared not voice. What happens when faith collides with steel that never ceases? The jungle held its breath, smoke coiling like incense at a funeral. In the distance, the faint metallic ping of an ejected clip rang out, impossibly clear, impossibly final. It echoed like a bell tolling for more than just the dead. It tolled for the end of an illusion. And as the sound faded into the night, every man who heard it felt the promise that the roar was not finished. Not yet. The air smelled of wet earth and gunpowder, the kind of mingled scent that seeped into skin and refused to leave. The jungle canopy swayed above, and in that shadowed cathedral, two armies prepared to write another chapter in blood. Night was falling, yet it was not darkness the Japanese feared most. It was the rhythm of steel, the relentless staccato of rifles that turned courage into silence. Lieutenant Robert Hayes adjusted his helmet and pressed his cheek against the cool stock of his Garand. He could hear faint murmurs from across the clearing, voices rising like prayers before a storm. He knew what was coming. The Japanese would charge, as they always did, a wave of humanity flung against a wall of fire. Hayes felt no thrill in the thought. He admired their bravery even as he dreaded the slaughter. His finger rested against the trigger, not with eagerness, but with the heaviness of inevitability. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka tightened the strap of his helmet and raised his bayonet, its steel glinting faintly in the dusk. He looked at his men, faces pale with exhaustion but lit by the stubborn flame of duty. Private Kenji Mori clutched his rifle so tightly his knuckles blanched, whispering the names of his family as though reciting a mantra. Corporal Yutaka Sato stood silent, his jaw firm, eyes darting toward the tree-line where the Americans waited. Tanaka knew the odds, knew that spirit alone could not stop bullets. Yet he also knew he could not ask his men to do less than everything. The bugle call cut through the night, sharp and raw, and the jungle seemed to exhale with it. The Japanese rose as one, a wave of shouts tearing from their throats. Banzai! The sound was more than a cry. It was an offering, a promise that flesh and spirit would be hurled forward without hesitation. Feet pounded the earth, bayonets gleamed like 100 shards of moonlight, and the charge surged into motion. Hayes lifted his rifle, the Garand answering with its thunder. The first shots cracked into the oncoming wave. Sparks of muzzle flash briefly, painting faces with light before snatching them away. The rhythm quickened, each shot an exclamation point against the rushing roar of voices. Miller shouted orders nearby, his voice steady as stone. "Hold steady. Keep firing." The Garands sang in unison, a mechanical choir drowning out the cries of men. Mori ran with the others, his feet heavy as though bound by chains of doubt. He saw comrades fall beside him, torn down mid-stride, and still he forced himself forward. He shouted, though the sound was lost in the cacophony. His bayonet trembled in his hands, not from fear alone, but from the realization that courage could not slow steel. Tanaka pressed onward, his chest burning, his voice hoarse from shouting. He had told his men's spirit would carry them through. Now, as he thrust forward into a hail of bullets, he realized spirit was not a shield but a torch. It burned brightly and briefly, consumed faster than he had ever admitted. Yet even as men fell, he kept charging, for to stop was to admit defeat, and that he could not do. Hayes fired until his clip sprang free with its sharp metallic ping. He grabbed another, hands moving with automatic precision. He barely registered the faces that rushed toward him. They were blurs of motion, swallowed by muzzle flash and shadow. Yet in the chaos, his eyes caught Maury's. The boy's face was twisted between terror and determination, his youth stark beneath the grime. For a heartbeat, Hayes hesitated, struck by the unbearable symmetry of it. Two young men, alike in age, torn into enemies by uniforms and commands. Then training reclaimed him, and he pulled the trigger. Maury stumbled as dirt exploded near his feet, his rifle slipping in his grasp. He dropped into the mud, lungs heaving, the bayonet useless in his hands. Around him, the charge faltered, bodies littering the clearing. He pressed his face against the earth, tears mingling with sweat, the roar of Garand's drumming in his skull. He had believed in honor, but here, honor seemed a word too fragile to withstand the storm. Sato pushed forward, defiance burning in his eyes, only to vanish beneath the thunder. Tanaka, still standing, raised his bayonet high, shouting once more into the teeth of the storm. For a brief moment, he looked like a figure carved from myth, unbroken and unbending. Then the Garand's rhythm caught him too, and he fell, his body folding into the soil he had sworn to defend. The clearing fell silent, except for the ringing in Hayes's ears and the hiss of smoke rising from barrels. His chest ached, not from exertion but from the weight of what had passed. He had witnessed bravery, raw and unyielding, and watched it crumble against steel. The Garand cooled in his hands, its heat fading like the echo of battle. He stared at it, feeling both gratitude and unease. It had saved him, yet it had also stripped the charge of its humanity, turning valor into statistics. Maury crawled backward into the underbrush, heart pounding, shame pressing on him heavier than the rifle he carried. He could not understand how spirit, drilled into him as invincible, had shattered so completely. He thought of Tanaka's voice, of the promise that courage could defy bullets. That voice was gone now, swallowed by the echo of steel. Hayes leaned against a tree, closing his eyes for a moment. He wanted to feel triumph, but what lingered instead was a hollow ache. He remembered Sato's determined face, Maury's wide eyes, Tanaka's defiant shout. They were not faceless enemies to him now. They were men. Men who had carried spirit like a torch and watched it be extinguished. The jungle absorbed the silence, its shadows deepening as if to hide the scars. For Hayes, for Maury, for the ghosts of Tanaka and Sato, the battle was not merely about ground gained or lost. It was about the collision of two truths, spirit against steel, courage against industry. And in that collision, something fundamental had shifted. The night grew still again, but the silence felt dangerous, like the pause between strikes of a storm not yet finished. Hayes exhaled slowly, his hand resting on the Garand as if it were both weapon and burden. Somewhere beyond the smoke, Maury's ragged breath whispered into the dark. And between them, though neither could hear the other, the echo of the clash remained. A reminder that the struggle was not over, and the next roar would come sooner than either man wished. The dawn over Saipan was not gentle. Smoke from the night's bombardment drifted across the ridges like torn veils, and the cries of the wounded punctured the stillness in jagged bursts. The jungle canopy shimmered with heat, dew sliding from leaves that trembled at the weight of another day's battle. In the shallow trenches cut into the volcanic soil, American Marines checked their rifles, their eyes red with fatigue but sharpened by necessity. Among them, Lieutenant Robert Hayes adjusted his Garand, fingers tracing the familiar steel as though reassuring himself that it still breathed with him. He had fought through nights of chaos, through ambushes where shadows seemed armed, but this morning carried a weight unlike any before. He could feel it in the stillness, in the way even birds refused to sing. Something enormous was coming. On the opposite ridge, Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka rallied what remained of his company. Their uniforms were torn, their faces gaunt, but their eyes, though dulled by exhaustion, still carried the flicker of resolve. Tanaka's voice was hoarse from shouting across too many nights, yet it rose with clarity as he addressed his men. They would charge, he said, one final time, as the Emperor demanded. They would throw themselves into the teeth of American fire, not because victory was certain, but because sacrifice was the only offering left. He knew the truth, though he did not share it. The rifles across the valley could not be stopped. Still, he gripped his bayonet, raising it high, for the soul of Japan demanded nothing less. Private Kenji Mori stood at the edge of the formation, his hands trembling around the worn wood of his rifle. He thought of home, his mother's kitchen, the sound of his younger sister laughing at the river's edge. But those memories felt impossibly distant, like dreams glimpsed through smoke. He wanted to believe that courage could still matter, that his body hurled forward would mean something against the storm. Yet doubt gnawed at him, heavier than hunger, sharper than thirst. He looked to Tanaka, and for a fleeting moment he borrowed strength from the older man's unwavering posture. The bugle call rose, brittle and piercing, and then the earth itself shook with the weight of thousands of feet. The Japanese charge surged forward, a tidal wave of flesh and voices, bayonets catching the sun like flashes of lightning. "Banzai!" they roared, the word tearing the morning air into ribbons of defiance. For Hayes, crouched behind sandbags, the sound froze his breath. He had faced charges before, but never like this. Never 3,000 men at once, sweeping toward him with the raw force of desperation. He lifted his Garand, and with the first pull of the trigger, the valley erupted. Muzzle flashes stitched the air, each crack a thunderclap. The Garands answered the charge with relentless rhythm, 8 rounds at a time, the metallic voices fusing into a storm that rolled down the slope. Hayes fired until his shoulder bruised, until the rifle felt like an extension of bone. Around him, Marines shouted, reloaded, fired again. The line of men transformed into a single unbroken wall of sound. Tanaka led from the front, his bayonet thrust high, shouting until his voice shredded. Bullets tore past him, striking men on either side, but still he charged. He had promised his men that spirit could breach the storm, and so he ran, even as doubt clawed at him, even as his heart knew the storm was endless. He reached halfway across the field before the storm found him, a burst of shots folding him to the ground. For an instant, he looked skyward, eyes fierce, as if daring heaven itself to acknowledge his fall. Then he lay still, swallowed by the charge that surged past him. Mori ran, his throat raw, his legs moving without consent. He saw Tanaka fall, and something inside him cracked. The shout in his mouth died, replaced by a hollow gasp. Still he ran, though tears blurred his vision, though the Garands tore gaps in the wave that had once been his company. Around him, bodies fell like wheat before the scythe, the air alive with the mechanical thunder of rifles that never seemed to pause. He stumbled, dropped his knees, then pressed forward again because stopping felt worse than death. Hayes reloaded, the metallic ping of the ejected clip ringing clear even in the chaos. To his ears, it sounded like a bell tolling, solemn and inevitable. He glanced at the faces rushing toward him, saw boys younger than himself, men older, all swallowed by the same cry of banzai. He fired again, not with hatred but with the numb certainty of survival. For every figure that fell, another appeared, until the charge itself seemed infinite. Yet the Garands did not tire, their rhythm carving the wave into fragments. The battle raged for hours, the ground turning black with smoke and red with blood. When the charge finally broke, the field was littered with bodies, the echoes of voices silenced beneath the weight of firepower. Hayes lowered his rifle, arms trembling, breath ragged. He could not feel victory in his chest, only a hollow ache that no amount of steel could fill. He stared at the horizon, where Mori crouched among the few survivors, his face pale, his bayonet hanging useless at his side. Their eyes met for an instant across the ruin, 2 young men bound by the knowledge that something irreversible had happened here. Mori dragged himself back toward the jungle, heart hammering, shame and grief mingling until he could no longer tell them apart. He thought of Tanaka, of the promise that spirit could endure anything, and he knew now that promise had shattered. The jungle whispered around him, carrying the echoes of Garand's like the tolling of 1,000 bells. Each ping of an ejected clip seemed to chase him, a sound too sharp to forget. Hayes sat heavily, the Garand across his lap, cooling in the humid air. He looked down at his hands, blackened with powder, and wondered what it meant that courage alone had been so thoroughly erased. He admired the bravery of the men who had charged, but admiration did not bring them back, nor did it ease the silence left behind. The sun climbed higher, casting harsh light across the battlefield. The thunder had passed, leaving only silence, a silence heavier than sound, thick with the weight of all it had devoured. Hayes listened, waiting for some new noise to break it, but the only sound that reached him was the faint metallic chime of a clip echoing in memory, tolling again and again. For him, for Maury, for the thousands who would never rise, that sound had become more than a signal. It was a requiem, a reminder that in this war, steel had spoken louder than spirit, and its voice would not be silenced.